Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Dennis MacDonald and David Mathisen back to the channel. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Today we're going to be doing something that I personally haven't seen before. We have two scholars approaching the same subject from different angles, different perspectives. But in essence, I'm sure they will agree. Today, we're going to be looking at Homer, the epics of Homer, and the correlation to the Gospels. We're also going to be looking at it from an astro-theological point of view, as well as from the many books and research that Dr. MacDonald has done, and see where there's an overlap and agreement in terms of the essence of the similarities and verification of the origins of the Gospels coming from Homer. So welcome, Dr. Dennis MacDonald. Welcome, David. Over to you, David.
Well, thanks so much, Esoteric. And let me know if the sound is okay. Great. I'm hearing an echo myself, so I have to figure out what's going on there. I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Yeah. And I can still hear you. Great. Well, it's an honor to meet you, Professor MacDonald. I listened to your interview with Esoteric, and it's really fascinating what you've discovered and your background. And you asked me about my background. I went to the U.S. Military Academy right out of high school, and then went into the infantry, where I was a infantry officer for a while. And then the Army saw fit to have me come back and teach in the Department of Literature and Philosophy at West Point. So they sent me to Texas A&M to get a master's in literature, which was a wonderful experience. And then I taught and got a chance to teach the Odyssey at West Point. And we used the Fagles translation, and I got to meet Professor Fagles.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. Yeah, the late great Professor Fagles. He came and spoke to us and autographed my copy of the Odyssey. But I had actually loved the Odyssey since I was a child, and I got a chance to go to Harvard summer school between my junior year and senior year of high school, where I took an Odyssey class, actually.
Is that right?
From a professor, yeah. So I graduated high school in '87. So that would have been the summer of '86, which is the year the Red Sox went to the series and lost to the Mets.
I was teaching at Harvard in 1986.
Is that right?
Yeah, I was there.
So Professor Theo Harris was my professor. Theo Harris, Theo Harris, which is obviously a Greek name. His first and last names are both Theo Harris. And he taught a course that was comparing the Odyssey, the Divine Comedy, and Harold Bloom, what is it? James Joyce, Ulysses.
Oh, yeah.
So it was permutations of the Odyssey. So that was a wonderful experience too. And of course, the Fagles translation wasn't even made at that time because it was 1999.
Right.
But anyway, that's just a little of my background. As I got out of the Army, I went into the civilian world, did not go into academia. I did actually get halfway to a PhD on the Army's dime at Texas A&M before I went and taught at West Point. But then when I got out, I was away from academia, which gave me some, freedom to explore whatever I wanted. And I stumbled into something that I wasn't deliberately looking for. I was a literalist Christian, taking the Bible literally, which is a long story, but I know you have some
That's right.
connections to that too.
I forgive you.
Thank you. But I got a book from my mother. My parents were going to Machu Picchu, and I got a book by Graham Hancock writing. It was called Heaven's Mirror, and it talks about Machu Picchu and other monuments as reflections of the heavens. And it references this 1969 book by two MIT scholars, Giorgio de Santillana and Herta von Deckend, called Hamlet's Mill, talking about permutations of the Hamlet myth and alleging that there was some kind of ancient, almost universal system, even evident in myths of the Americas and the Pacific and Asia, and connecting to Gilgamesh and Finnish epics and the Norse myths. And they're showing some evidence for that. And I became really fascinated by that. But I was always standoffish whenever they would say, oh, and the Bible stories seem to fit into this pattern too. I said, no, come on. I know that Samson was a literal strongest man. You know, that's what the Bible says. And I wasn't really that literalist growing up. This was something that happened to me in the Army as a result of various relationships with women and, trying to fix who I was. I was searching for things. And the Bible, I am convinced, is full of beauty and truth, but it's not literal. It's not a literal text, but I was taking it literally. So I was resistant to evidence that the Bible was part of this system. But knowing the Bible so well, because I got to the point where when I was studying for my master's, I didn't even read on Sundays except the Bible. I didn't watch the NFL. I just studied the Bible or commentaries on a Sunday. No work. So I knew it really well. And as I saw this system present in the myths of other cultures more and more, because I came obsessed with trying to understand what the authors of Hamlet's Mill were talking about. They were seeing something, but not really that clearly. I give them credit for seeing it, but it's really mistaken in some of their interpretations. But they did a great, thing by seeing this. They were attacked for it. I think they were pretty late in their career when they wrote it. They both since long passed, but it's been kind of lambasted and marginalized. And it relies on a lot of kind of 1800s philology that's not necessarily in vogue anymore. But I became like that person with the strings in the shed out back that's trying to figure out, what is this mystery? I think the authorities haven't got it figured out. And the more I started to, because I grew up actually with the stars, going out and seeing the constellations. In the Army, I was in the infantry, so out in the night sky all the time. I was very familiar with the constellations. And in fact, the outlining system that I grew up with by H.A. Rey, the author of Curious George, this is a whole nother area that's very interesting. He said, there's a problem with the way we outline the stars. Let me suggest a better way. And the authors of Hamlet's Mill do not use his system. He only published it in 1952, but it's still in print, H.A. Rey's system. He called it the stars, a new way to see them. But if you take a look at even ancient artwork, it should really be called the stars, a very ancient way to see them. His outlining system really helps you to see the connections. The authors of Hamlet's Mill didn't avail themselves of that. Anyway, long story short, I became obsessed with it. I saw more and more connections. I actually went through a crisis of faith. You know, here I am as a dad, taking my children to church, my family to church every week, teaching Sunday school. And I realized, you know, all the literalist positions are flawed. And I left. And that was a kind of a long process, a couple of years of transition in my mind, having to have enough evidence to make that step. But I'm convinced, I'll just close off here, what I was searching for in the Bible, those ancient scriptures, just like the myths of other cultures, are addressing those profound needs that we have. You don't lose any of the truth and the beauty that's there when you leave the religious dogmas that have been built on top, I would say mistakenly, on top of texts that were never intended to be literal. All you lose is the problematic parts, the exclusivity.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You know, the literalistic parts. Oh, I'm descended from this group literally, or you're not. You keep all the parts that the lessons that it's really teaching are not dependent on taking them literally any more than you have to believe that there was a literal Hercules. So that's just a bit of background.
Okay, David, thank you. That's fascinating. Do you
And I'm
want me to
interested in
respond to
your
that, Esoteric and David, or?
Well, I'm really interested in your work, and also, you know, some of the scholarly pushback or response that you talked about with Esoteric, and he actually asked a little bit more about it because it seems to make perfect sense. It's not even arguing anything that's outside of a conventional paradigm to say that the works of Homer, or attributed to Homer, were so influential.
Oh, they were all over the place. Yeah.
They're not far away.
There are so many things that you talked about, David, that I'm going to focus on two of them, but they only tangentially relate to your experience directly. One is the importance of astronomy or astrology in ancient literature, related especially to the Homeric epics. The second is the question of how these texts mean, what they intended to mean, and the level of sophistication or naivete, depending on what your solution is, to their theological agenda. Let's start with the stars. The ancients were obsessed with constellations. And we know this in part because of their navigation at sea, that they could navigate much better at night because of the relative position of the stars and the constellations than they could during the day, especially if there's cloud cover from the sun. They couldn't put into port, and they didn't leave port at night, but they often loved to sail at night because they could be more specific about their arrangements. The other is that in ancient societies, the average person probably was able to travel by foot or cart or horse only with a 100-mile radius. And but they could see the constellations in the heavens, which opened their universe to them. And if they visited someone outside of their territory, they had in common the constellations. And so they could, and so this is one reason you have the ubiquity of Greek religion. It goes all around the Mediterranean, and it has analogies in Egypt and Mesopotamia and so on, because they shared the stars. We also know that before Homer, the deities often were related to astronomical phenomena. So Zeus has lightning bolts and he's the god of thunder. Poseidon is the god of water. Hades is the netherworld. Demeter and Dionysus are donor deities with the earth, and so on. Apollo gets identified and Artemis get identified with the moon. So what happened with the Homeric epics is that these local deities then are given genetic connections. And, you know, who's the father, who's the mother, who are the children, and so on. And they have particular characteristics. So Zeus has characteristics of thunder. Apollo has characteristics of wisdom. The Poseidon has characteristics of being mercurial, inconsistent. Hades is not a ladies' man because he's in charge of Hades and so on. So the Homeric epics are trading on this mythology that owes a great deal probably to astronomy. After the composition of the epics, we have moralists who don't like it that the Greek gods take sides in the Trojan War, that even the king of all gods sleeps with mortal men and has countless children by them. And so they devise through astronomy moral allegories, so that these stories are really not telling you about the gods, they're giving you allegorical advice about the heavens relate to each other and so on. And there are other strategies for allegorizing away the moral problems of Greek epic. The poets themselves, though, probably are not so conscious of the astrological background. They have other agendas at play. And so we can talk about to what extent astronomy or astrology helps us understand these texts. But the ancients generally did not read them with reference to the stars. They read it in terms of cultural identity, so that Homer, as you said, became ubiquitous because he had defined to large measure what it meant to be Greek. Now, so that's the first comment I would make about your interest in astronomy, which is admirable, and it's all over the ancient world. It's in Homer, but it doesn't help explain really much of the narrative, in my opinion. But the other piece that you were talking about is, can we, what kind of literature do we think the Gospels are? What were they trying to accomplish? And the advantage of reading the Gospels over against classical Greek literature, David, in my opinion, is that it's a struggle for cultural identity. Because Homer was studied in school, was used in debates and even in courts of law to talk about the rhetoric of good and evil and so on. As Hegel said, Homer was the oxygen that Greeks breathed. It was almost everywhere. So if you're trying to establish your social identity over against Greekness, you're going to be looking at mythological poetry, especially Homer, but also some of the tragedians, especially Euripides. And the favorite target of Jews and Christians seems to have been the Bacchae, which we can talk about to some extent later. The example that I think everyone knows about is that when Virgil wants to hand over to the Emperor Augustus a treatise on what it means to be Roman, he writes the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas's rescue from Troy. And to do so, he borrows extensively from the Homeric epics, but also from other poetry. And so Virgil has a project, and this is already before the Common Era. He writes poetry that imitates Homer to establish a new cultural identity for Romans. Aeneas is the founder of a country in a way that none of the Homeric heroes were. Aeneas is more moral and trustworthy than and Odysseus. And so the famous expression with the epithet Pius Aeneas means pious Aeneas, the trustworthy Aeneas. Well, you couldn't say that about Greek heroes. You couldn't say it even about their deities. Jupiter is a more venerable character. Venus isn't, but Jupiter is more venerable than Zeus. But Jews, even before the time of Virgil, were already imitating Greek poetry in order to have Jewish characters to be presented as more virtuous. And then this becomes common in the Gospels. So their readers know the cultural repertoire of Homer and Greek poetry, and they're reacting to it. They're not fond of the immorality of Greek deities and the importance of warfare. And they have a hero who was Jewish, who was a Jewish reformer, who got himself heroically killed because of his message. And he became a pleasant target for remythologizing. But the stories in the Gospels are really not about Jesus. They're about Jesus's followers. That is, what is their social identity? What are their social values? What do they live by? What wisdom do they cherish? What narratives do they live by? What are their social mores? How does it differ from the Greeks? So in Greek composition, there's a word called synkresis, which means simply a moral comparison of two characters. And what we have in the Gospels, and most readers, even scholars, don't recognize it, is moral comparisons with Greek mythological characters, so that Jesus and his followers are more virtuous. They're less violent. Jesus is more powerful because he's God's son and his only son, and so on. So we have been misreading the Gospels because we read them against Jewish backgrounds, we read them against each other, but that is not how the authors expected these texts to be read. They were expected to be read against the dominant culture and to portray Jesus and his followers as more virtuous. And so your comment, David, earlier about the wisdom of these texts, I think is very sophisticated. The issue of the mythologizing of Jesus is not a negative discovery. It really is a positive discovery. It allows us to see what was at stake in the valorization of him, and also makes the evangelists no longer stupid nincompoops who are trying to pull the wool over the scientific world. Rather, they had a different agenda, and it had to do with social identity. So at some point, maybe we can talk about a methodology I use called social identity criticism, which allows one to take a look at virtually any ancient text, including Homer himself, and to say, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, what is being valorized, what is the social identity of the author and his expected readers, and so on. So your journey is in some ways very different from mine, but I think we've come to some similar conclusions. So those are just some random thoughts about what you presented so far. I'd be interested in knowing what Esoteric wants to make of all this, by the way.
Before I share my thoughts, David, can you show some examples that of in your presentation of astro-theology tying to Homer tying to the Gospels, so we can actually see
Sure.
how we can join the dots.
Esoteric's leading the witness here, but no. Let me say thank you for those thoughts, Professor MacDonald, and I agree that we have come to a place that has a lot of similarities, and maybe some of the differences that we bring out, because it's like throwing off sparks, will be helpful to both of us and to listeners to concentrate on maybe some of the differences. And I'll put forward an argument that I would say we might call it, like physics, they talk about the weak gravitational force or the strong, or you could be a strong materialist. I'm going to put forward maybe a strong argument, not in terms of saying, oh, my argument is so strong, but I'm going to put forward a more aggressive argument and try and provide some support to argue that the stories in the Bible, and I'm not restricting to the New Testament or even to the Old Testament. I know that you're very learned on the Apocrypha. I would argue that these characters and events, going all the way back to Genesis, or the stories in the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea, are celestial and based on celestial figures that can be identified with specific constellations. This is obviously a very not ambitious thesis to lay out, but I'll start with some visuals and see if I can provide some arguments to say that not just the stories in the Bible. I don't even believe that Jesus is necessarily a historical figure. He's clearly a celestial figure. I think the historical part has to be proven without reference to these celestial metaphorical texts, any more than Odysseus is a literal figure or Heracles is a literal figure. But I'll start with Artemis, actually, because first they've got a very visual example to help us, but also because it does relate to some episodes in the Odyssey where figures are compared to Artemis. It's not that Artemis is really a central figure in the story, but here's a picture of me back in 2016 in the Boston Museum of Fine Art. I was really excited to get to see this bell crater. You can see how big it is.
I helped start the Sojourner magazine, by the way.
Oh, wow.
I was one of the initial, actually, the first volume wouldn't have happened without my bank account. So yeah,
wow.
In fact, we had a 50th reunion recently. So I'm a Sojourner too.
Well, I did hear that actually in your, bio when you were talking with Esoteric previously, and the impact of the Martin Luther King tragic, horrible assassination.
Right.
I was born in '69, so right after that,
yeah,
in July. So like the Manson murders happened right after that. But that whole period, we could go off on a tangent because I believe there's obviously a lot more going on there than we've been told as well. But actually, this is a Sojourner Surfboards shirt. But clearly the founder of Sojourner Surfboards is using the same biblical reference that we're sojourning here in this.
And by the way, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts is a fantastic museum, isn't it?
It's so wonderful. And this bell crater has been there for a long time, as we'll see. I'm going to zoom in on that picture and make it a little clearer. And you can see that this just beautiful artwork. It's from the early 5th century BC or BCE. It is Artemis in the act of slaying the unfortunate Prince Actaeon. And here's let me see if I can get us out of the way. Can you see the whole thing with Actaeon?
Yeah, I'm okay.
I'm minimizing us. Sorry about that. So here comes Actaeon and Artemis. Actaeon stumbles across Artemis while she's bathing. I'm not going to go into the whole myth, but this is a drawing that appeared showing, because it's curved, I put up the drawing so it's easier to see. This is from John Beazley, who's a big scholar, Sir John Beazley, 1885 to 1970. And he wrote this book called Attic Red Figure Vases in American Museums, 1918. This is page 113. He says, look, there's no finer vase in Boston, no finer vase anywhere than this one. And he, down at the bottom, the Artemis and Actaeon is perhaps the most finished group in all vase painting. So he was really high on this artwork. But when I saw this in the Boston Museum, I had already been going down this road of stars and myths for a little while. I immediately recognized this is a celestial scene, and I'm going to draw it out here. The Milky Way is in the center of your picture. I'm highlighting it there, and I'm going to remove that so you can see the Milky Way, glorious. And this is the brightest part of the Milky Way. In fact, this part, astronomers call it the galactic center. It's like a widening and a brightening. And I have found abundant evidence that the ancient myths use this as a pool or a grotto or a widening, like a nice place to take a bath. That's where Artemis is taking a bath when Actaeon stumbles upon her. And right next to that widest, brightest part of the Milky Way, we have the zodiac constellation of Sagittarius. And so here's the artwork. There's the outline of Sagittarius. Right next to the wide part of the Milky Way, which could be like a river, but the widest part is the grotto where she's bathing with her nymphs. And we have echoes of this in the Odyssey, of course, when Aphrodite in the poem gets captured in bed in an adulterous affair with Ares. She retreats to take a bath with her graces on the island of Cyprus. Or when Nausicaa is going down to wash the clothing with her maidens, she's compared specifically to Artemis. But let me show the celestial connections. Sagittarius is pointing its bow. It can play male figures and female figures. In fact, the twins of Artemis and Apollo that you mentioned are both associated mostly with Sagittarius. But pointing right to Scorpio, look at the angle of Actaeon that this painter has done. And I'm going to blow it up, make it bigger, so you can really see some of these correspondences. This doesn't prove, this is artwork. It doesn't prove that the stories are based on the stars. And to your point about the poets, the artists also may not have understood this esoteric system, but I can prove it from texts. It's just more visual to prove it, to illustrate it from artwork. Look at the correspondences here, especially with Artemis, but also with the angling of Actaeon and the dogs, his own hunting hounds, tearing him to shreds. I'm just going to show a characteristic of this constellation in the sky is that it appears to be walking one way. I put in that arrow going to the left on our screen, but looking back the other way, or even shooting the other way. So walking one way, looking the other way. You might recall the story of Lot's wife, which terrified me as a child. She walking one way, Look back, pillar of salt. But here's Artemis walking one way, clearly the artist depicting her walking one way, looking back the other way. And her feet, you can see the Sagittarius outline looks like it's wearing a dress, and the legs down below are protruding below the hem of the dress. So we can see her ankles. And that is mentioned in different Homeric epithets, like blank of the lovely ankles will sometimes be mentioned in the text. But look at the correspondence there. The angle of the knee corresponds to the outline of Sagittarius. The angle of the bow, even. There's a different way of holding the bow if you're associated with Orion. We'll take a look at Orion a little later. But this angle of the bow is more Sagittarius. And the artist has even put in this little samurai sword or quiver or something on her back with it like a tassel. And then this is a distinctive feature of the constellation Sagittarius. And I'll just point one more thing out. I could go on and on about this, but this little curly Q tail of one of the hunting hounds, I'm going to argue is a weaker connection, but look at that curly Q tail. Look at this constellation right next to Sagittarius. This is called the Southern Crown, Corona Australis. And in fact, in the book of Revelation, we have the scorpion, Sagittarian, scorpion-tailed. It's in Revelation chapter 9, I think. But they have golden crowns. They have long hair like women. They have scorpion tails that hurt men for 5 months. So this is the same part of the sky. They open the keys to the bottomless pit. The smoke rises up from the bottomless pit. That's the Milky Way. So these are connections to the Artemis story. That there's other textual things in Homeric hymns. They're not really probably written by Homer, but that attribute certain aspects to Sagittarius in text that help us to line her up with Sagittarius. But I'll just pause for a moment. Are some of those connections pretty evident?
Well, I think it's very clever. And before I respond, let me ask a few questions.
Sure.
Do you think let's grant, hypothetically, that the author was aware of these forms in the sky, okay? Do you think he expected his viewers to recognize them?
It's a very perspicacious question, a very penetrating question. So obviously I have to say I have no idea, but what I suspect, Professor MacDonald, is that there was some very ancient system that predates Greece and predates even Sumer, because we can see this same, I'm going to show, this is just like a little intro connection. I'm going to relate it to Odyssey in a second. But we can see it in the Gilgamesh cycle, which is, some scholars think 2100 BCE for some of those fragments. The Inanna story from ancient Sumer, the Osiris cycle from the pyramid text, very ancient, 2000. The Vedas from India. I'm going to labor to show some examples, a couple examples from cultures that might not have been so soaked and immersed in the Homer epics as the New Testament times. I believe that this system predates Sumer because it's full blown. in Gilgamesh. It's full-blown in the Egyptian myths. It's full-blown in the Vedas, which are maybe 1200 BCE, according to some scholars. China, even North America. So
well, how would you
obviously go
well,
ahead.
how would you, very simply put, how would you define that tradition? What are its dominant characteristics so we could recognize it?
Basing myth on stars and heavenly cycles, which is
okay, all right, but you don't necessarily have examples of Artemis Actaeon, right?
No, I don't have a specific Artemis Actaeon story. No,
okay.
Different permutations. Yeah.
One of the things that you one of the things that you didn't point out that I think is probably your strongest evidence is if you were to reverse the images and to put Artemis on the right-hand side and Actaeon on the other, you wouldn't have these correlations at all. Right?
well, so sometimes artists will reverse it. This one is not. They're in the right positioning. But sometimes artists will reverse it, almost as if they're looking at the stars from outside of an imaginary globe.
All right, okay. So that's important. Now,
but the characteristics of Sagittarius, this plume on top of the head.
Oh, okay. Can you give the image again for us?
Yes. Share screen.
Okay, I'm not an expert on Attic pottery, although I do know something about it. One of the things that's fascinating in this image is that you have it very similar images related to Artemis's brother, namely Apollo.
Yes, that's right.
And you have the death of Hector, which on the left-hand side, you have Athena, the woman, who has a spear, who is not using it, but is encouraging Achilles to kill Hector. On the right-hand side, you have Hector swooning like this. He's already been hit by a spear. And on his right-hand side is Achilles, I'm sorry, Apollo. And Apollo has his feet turning away and he's holding his bow and arrow entirely useless. He's not going to use them to help Hector, whereas Athena is helping. Now, the orientation of the feet going away is, I think, more naturally to be understood as Artemis rejecting the sexual advances she feared from Actaeon. And so she's escaping. And of course, apparently she only needs one arrow to do the job because she's holding the other in the opposite direction, which is similar to what you have with Apollo. The other irony to this is Actaeon was accused, perhaps falsely, of spying on Artemis as she bathed in order to get a good look at this beauty. But guess whose body is exposed in this? It's his body, not hers. So I think I think for most viewers of the vase would be more oriented toward the mythology of Actaeon than the astronomy. But maybe you're onto something. I guess one question I have, and I do know that this is important in the interpretation of pottery, is why is it in a bell crater? A bell crater was used for mixing wine and water in order then to put it into the cups, and usually at a feast of some kind. And of course, these feasts were often attended by lovemaking, or at least flirtation. And one wonders if this is a warning to boys about getting too flirtatious to the women who are giving the cups. I mean, this is, it's a strange image, actually, to have on a wine crater, in my view. And there's a certain irony to it, in my view. But I don't know if you've given that some thought. You may be onto something. I mean, certainly astronomy is important in the ancient world, and we both talked about that, and that's clear. The issue is, how sophisticated can an artist expect his viewers to be able to demythologize them this way? And I guess I'm a little more skeptical.
Very, very great points. It may be esoteric in that it is not known to all, not
That's
even
right.
necessarily to the
that could
artist.
Be, yeah.
But your points about, you're immediately starting to make wonderful connections to other myths, such as Hector in the Iliad. Now, Athena, I can demonstrate, I don't have it in this slideshow. She's a different constellation. She springs full grown from the head of her father Zeus. As you point out, she carries a spear, not a bow. So she's associated with a different constellation that is nearby that we're going to meet. But Hector being dragged in the dust, and you point out in the angle of Actaeon, in my book from 2016, I argue that when Hector is being dragged in the dust, he is associated with Scorpio, and the dust cloud rising up from his hair is the Milky Way. But also in the Iliad, very early, we have the incident of Briseis, which of course you know, but for our listeners, Achilles was given this girl, Briseis, as a reward for a successful battle, but then Agamemnon decides he likes her. And this leads to the whole Iliad, where Achilles gives her up and says, fine, I'm not going to fight anymore. See how well you do without me. And when Briseis is led away, when Achilles says, go ahead, take her, she looks back almost longingly or regretfully towards the tent where Achilles is sulking, looks back, just like Sagittarius. And the tent can be argued to be a different constellation, Ophiuchus, which I'll show in a moment. So I'm just introducing this concept that I'm trying to argue with this one bell crater. Those are great points, but I want to continue to actually the Odyssey and talk just briefly, now that we've met these two constellations, Sagittarius and Scorpio, I would argue that Nausicaa, I'm using the pronunciations from Professor Fagel's volume that I was teaching when I was at West Point. They have a pronunciation guide that I typically default to. But she's the princess of Phaeacia. When Odysseus finally gets off of the island of Ogygia and he makes his way across the sea, and Poseidon smashes up his raft, he finally makes his landfall in the land of the Phaeacians, and the princess Nausicaa is aroused from sleep by the goddess Athena. She's always looking out for Odysseus, and she says, hey, Nausicaa, you've got dirty clothes all over the floor. Go take them down to the river. And she takes her maidens down to the river, or down to the water's edge. And she's specifically described as being like the goddess Artemis among her nymphs, except a head taller. So I've just tried to establish that Artemis is associated with Sagittarius, and I could throw more textual evidence, but I'm just taking it as established for sake of argument. Nausicaa would also be associated with this same constellation. And I'm also going to argue that in that episode when Odysseus gets off of Calypso's island, makes his homemade raft, starts sailing across the vast ocean, Poseidon gets enraged. He's coming back from visiting some of his worshipers far away, and he sees Odysseus making his way across the ocean. And he says, "What? I said that man would never get back." And he smashes up the raft. And I refer to this as like the baptism of Odysseus, just like the baptism of Jesus at the start of the Gospels. A goddess comes down in the shape of a seabird. Some translators say a gull. Professor Fagles calls it a shearwater. Comes down, and it's the goddess Leucothea, who in her mortal life was called Ino of the lovely ankles. So we pointed out the ankles that are prominent in Sagittarius. I would argue that Ino is also associated with Sagittarius, but directly above in the Milky Way, there are two constellations of birds, one flying upwards, Aquila, which is just above Sagittarius. I didn't outline it. And one flying down, Cygnus, the swan, the more graceful and peaceful of the two, like the dove descending. It is my argument or my contention that this scene, Leucothea in the baptism, comes down in the form of a bird, then takes on the beautiful shape of a goddess, Sagittarius. And where's Odysseus on his raft? He is just above Scorpio, this very important constellation, which is known as Ophiuchus, the serpent holder, the serpent bearer, which incidentally is why you have verses in the New Testament that say things like, "You shall handle serpents and not be stung." And some people taking that literally still handle poisonous snakes. But you can see how it's kind of holding a snake. On the left is called the serpent's tail. And there's this oblong figure in the middle, which looks like a tent or a pavilion or a tower or even a house with a peaked roof. Remember, I said Briseis was looking back at the tents when she was led away in the Iliad. But in the Odyssey, Odysseus, when he's paddling around on a plank, is straddling the plank. You can see the 2 feet down below Ophiuchus, down below that central plank or oblong rectangle. But the real evidence that makes me argue that this is Odysseus on the raft is that Leucothea, the goddess, says to Odysseus, "You're in trouble. I'm here to help. I'm going to give you my girdle or my sash. Take off all your clothes, tie this around your waist, dive into the ocean, give up the wreckage that you're holding on to, and swim. And the girdle, the sash, will protect you." And Odysseus immediately starts going, "Is this a trap? Another god or goddess trying to mess with me? Or is this a real offer of aid?" Which is a characteristic of Odysseus. He's very circumspect. But he says, I'll try and make it by myself. If things get really bad, then I'll follow the goddess's advice, which things get really bad. He takes off his clothes. He puts on the sash. And she says, "When you get to land, throw it back, give it back." Now look at Ophiuchus, the serpent on either side. That could be a serpent, And you might say, oh, it's speculative. That can be a sash or a winding sheet. And in the baptism of Jesus, which I'll show, he just is wearing a sash, and the dove of the Holy Spirit coming down by the river Jordan. We find
Wait, Jesus is wearing a
Osiris.
sash at his baptism?
Well, he's just depicted basically wearing a cloth around his waist.
Well, yeah,
Or you
but
could
that's
think
not
of,
in the text. I'm going
Yeah.
to try to jump in here, David.
Sure. Yeah, let me just finish by saying Sir Gawain in the Green Knight, he also is given a girdle by the queen, like a female garment to wear for his protection. It's the same pattern. Osiris is wrapped in a cloth. I would argue that sash.
Well, in
corresponds to
world
the
mythology,
serpent
you
of
have magical tokens given all the time to people who are in
Mhm.
trouble. I mean, Hermes does the same thing to Odysseus with Circe and so on. I don't buy your stuff with the gospel stories of the baptism at all, David, not at all. But there's a story in the Acts of the Apostles that is interesting. Paul is on a ship. He is going to Rome. And he says, an angel came to me and said, you can't abandon ship, but you will all be saved. And people then are take some courage, and they stay with the ship until it capsizes, and then they swim to shore. So you have this idea of donor deities using magical objects to intervene with people who are not well. But surely the story of Jesus baptism has more to do with Athena flying to Telemachus to encourage him to claim his father's estate. Now, I don't mean to be that critical, because David, you're a very creative fellow, and you've got a visual sense that I admire. But I think this becomes so esoteric, and use that word yourself, of
Sure.
this business, that it requires a kind of astrological consciousness that you have, but I don't think many ancients did. Now, that's not to say that the astrological world wasn't important in antiquity. We both agree that it was, and that the deities themselves, both in their characteristics and occasionally in their narratives, they have echoes of astrology or astronomy. So and you're very clever about these things. And I think if these images are to work for you the way you want them to, it's going to be more of an issue of perhaps artistic recognition and inspiration than it is of interpretation of these stories. The fact, though, that you're interested in crossing cultures, the Middle East, Greece and Rome, the New Testament, Gospels, and so on, is commendable. And of course, as you know, you have devoted years of your life to studying these texts. It becomes very difficult. Use the image of someone in the backyard with strings trying to draw connections. It reminds me of detective novels or detective movies, where you're trying to say who done it and so on. But with ancient mythology, of course, it is layer over layer over layer of ambiguity and so on.
Yes, I don't take offense to criticism at all. So let me labor to, I think that's a very interesting connection to the Acts shipwreck incident, where incidentally Paul finds a snake among the logs or something when he gets to land.
And also in the Nausicaa thing, when she finds Odysseus, she thinks he's like a god. When the Maltese see Paul and he survives the snake bite, they think he's Hathias.
Those are great connections that I didn't see, but let me labor to, I don't want to major on it, but I do have some slides with the baptism scene of Jesus coming up, but let me see where we are here. I want to go to the next slide after this one. Yeah, this one. So now that I've introduced those constellations, I'll get to the baptism in just a moment. We can see Ophiuchus above Scorpio, next to the Milky Way, Sagittarius. So we're familiar at least a little bit now with these. I want to move them over so I can bring in, I'm going to move further east, cross-cultural, as you said, to India, to a couple of different stories to demonstrate, and I'm going to work it back to the Bible. This is Krsna, the god Krsna. He's actually an avatar of the god Vishnu, but the god Krsna playing his flute, dancing on the head of a venomous serpent whose name is the Kaliya or Naga, usually just pronounced Kaliya. I won't go through the whole story, but this Kaliya is poisoning the river Yamuna, and Krsna throws a ball into the river, which is like Nausicaa in the Odyssey, but I just thought of that. But all the villagers are horrified and say, hey, young Krsna, don't go in there to get the ball. There's a terrible serpent. But that's Krishna's intention to prove he's going to demonstrate his divinity now. He's going to reveal that he's a god before he hadn't. And the Kaliya comes and says, you're going to die now. And Krsna begins to dance on his head and grow larger and larger. And then he assumes the weight of the whole universe. And you can see he's playing the flute, which is a characteristic of Krsna. And the weight of Krsna starts to make blood come out of the mouths of the Kaliya, usually depicted with multiple heads. So I'll show you one with multiple heads in a minute. But this, I argue, is a celestial-based myth. Oh, you can see the wives of the Kaliya coming and saying, Krsna, they're making the Anjali Mudra, which is the recognition of divinity in you, divinity in me. We're more familiar maybe in the West saying praying hands, amen, which is a recognition of divinity. But they're saying, please don't kill him, just send him somewhere else where he can stay within his proper boundaries. And Krsna is merciful and lets the Kaliya go. Now look at the flute held off to the side. He's dancing on a serpent. It's a multi-headed serpent, which I'll show in a moment. Look at Ophiuchus, who is standing on Scorpio. I would argue that that serpent's tail is very mutable. The system is very mutable, and maybe it's just me being clever and seeing things that aren't there, but there's enough evidence that I can point out that this is not just me seeing what's not there. Let me show a couple more. Here's one showing that the Kaliya is definitely multi-headed, just like the Hydra in Greek myth that Hercules fights. The constellation Hercules is just above Ophiuchus. We'll see it in a minute. But again, the flute held off to the side, and the folded hands of the supplicating wives of the Kaliya, I would argue, is Sagittarius. The bow can actually be depicted as folded hands. We can see it even in depictions of Joseph in the Old Testament. But one more, he's standing on the heads of Scorpio. Here's one where you can really see the multiple heads. Standing on one leg, which is an interesting characteristic of Ophiuchus. I would say probably because one of those legs is fainter in the sky on Ophiuchus. but clearly the multiple heads, Ophiuchus standing on Scorpio. What's really interesting about this more modern statue of Krsna, which they still enact every year in certain villages. They'll have one of the teenagers in the village play the role of Krsna, and the older guys will push a raft that's like, looks like the cobra, with the teenager standing on top, dressed up as the god, playing the flute. Look at the red band on the Kalianog. There is a red star right in the heart of Scorpio, right behind all the hoods, right behind all the lines, called Antares. It's a red star. That's not definitive, of course, but it's interesting. But what really interests me for our purposes is this passage. I'm sure you're very familiar with it, from Genesis 3:15, because this shows this system didn't just come to the New Testament from Homer. This is in the stories of Joseph and his brothers, Moses crossing the Red Sea, and this is from the Adam and Eve story, when the serpent is being cast out after the fall. I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head. Ophiuchus is the seed of the woman. I could show it's right next to Virgo, as if Virgo has just given birth to Ophiuchus. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel, which is sometimes, as I'm sure you know, called the proto-gospel. Oh, this is a Genesis foretelling of what Jesus will do on the cross. And it's not necessarily wrong, because Jesus on the cross is based on these same constellations, I would argue. But look at how Ophiuchus is bruising the heads of Scorpio, and Scorpio's heads are literally right next to the heel of Ophiuchus. So I'm trying to show, I'm not denying the influence of Homer on the New Testament writers, or on Josephus, which you've seen it. I also have seen that. The system, however, I'm making a more ambitious and difficult to prove argument, appears to be bigger, wider, and older. And I'm going to show one more quickly to relate back to the Odyssey. This is a different god. Krsna is an avatar of this god. This is Vishnu, painting from the 1870s, but this is in the Sanskrit texts, sleeping on the serpent known as Adishesha, or sometimes Adishesha Ananta, which apparently in Sanskrit means without end, the endless eternal serpent. And as he's dreaming, a lotus flower is growing up out of his navel. Very interesting, a little bizarre. And on top of it is the god Brahma, the great creator, on top of the lotus. And then at Vishnu's feet is his consort Lakshmi. And she's even almost like washing his feet, which is interesting. But that lotus is what I really want to focus in on, because of the potential parallel to the Odyssey that I'm about to argue. Let's see if we can find it in the heavens, where we've already been looking. There's Vishnu. This is a very important part of the heavens. It's where the Milky Way crosses at its brightest point with the zodiac. So it has esoteric significance in this system that I've been exploring. This is my argument, but there's Ophiuchus again. Now, could he be reclining or resting on a serpent instead of dancing? This time he's just resting. But where on Ophiuchus could be a lotus coming out of his navel. Well, either side of the serpents could really be coming out of his navel, but the side that's looking more like a lotus flower to me is what we call the serpent head side of Ophiuchus. I'm going to argue that in some myths, that becomes a lotus. And coming out of the navel, now we understand why, when he's on the serpent with multiple heads, with Lakshmi there at his feet, Sagittarius, he has a lotus, strangely, coming out of his navel. And what is on top of the lotus? Well, in the Vishnu story, it's the god Brahma, who has 4 heads. Above the lotus and above Ophiuchus is the constellation we call Hercules, which has a very square head, suggestive of a man with a full beard, but it could be 4 square heads looking in other directions. There's other reasons why Brahma might be associated with Hercules. I actually argue that Zeus, the father of Hercules, or Heracles, Zeus is, and I can show you pottery, where Zeus is in this deep posture holding the thunderbolt, is associated with this constellation. In the Odyssey, right at the beginning, well, in book 5, I think, Athena goes to Zeus and says, this king is so virtuous, he's getting so badly treated, nobody's going to want to be virtuous anymore. Father Zeus, can't you let him go home? And Zeus nods his head in assent. And you can see Hercules, the constellation, almost looks like he has his head slightly bowed or nodding in assent. But I'm getting ahead of my lotus reference. Of course, in the Odyssey, we have the terrible episode where Odysseus sends 3 of his men to find some water, and they run into the lotus eaters, and they never come back because they eat the lotus too. They lose all memory of home. They lose all desire to go home. And look at Hercules. Look at what I've argued with reference to a myth from ancient India. Is a lotus in some myths? Is Hercules like reaching down to get the lotus? I would argue there's a celestial component to the lotus eaters episode. So I'll pause there. I think my next thing is the baptism of Jesus, which has a really important Odyssey reference with the winnowing fan. But I'll just pause before like you said, you're totally not convinced about the baptism argument, so I'll try and go into that, but I don't want to be too selfish with the time.
Well, I want to hear from Esoteric where you'd like this to go. I really don't want to revisit the baptism stuff, so I'd rather kind of stay where we are and kind of play with the issues that are already here. But I'd like to let Esoteric kind of direct the discussion a little bit.
For me, it's just interesting to see, and in particular, listen to your critique, Dr. MacDonald, because the first time you're seeing this, being so well versed in the Homeric epics, and with David presenting a case for the astro-theological origins of these myths, for me, it's interesting to hear you real time give a critique and the reason why you believe that some of these correlations may be too far-fetched. So I'd like you to continue your critique. I appreciate the dialogue between the two of you.
Well, first of all, David, I thought that your images were wonderful. especially from India. And the presentation that you gave was quite impressive. And I wouldn't be surprised that in terms of the mythology of Indian religion, Hinduism, that you would have some astrological connections there. So I'm not an authority on that at all. So I'm just going to cede that conversation. But I wouldn't be surprised that some of these images get evoked by cosmic phenomena. So let me be there. The question that I guess the larger methodological question I would ask you is, in all the texts you're dealing with, there are multiple explanations that have been given and still could be given for what we read. So we've already talked about this with the baptism of Jesus a bit. That you are interested in the leukotheia or Eno visitation to Odysseus. I think it's more likely that it's Athena flying to Telemachus to empower to take over his family. The issue of the angel coming to Paul on a ship, in my view, is similar to the Enotheia, the Eno-leukotheia visitation to Odysseus, and afterwards he's considered to be a god and so on. So the methodological question is, how does one determine, what criteria would one use to determine whether, let's say, the episode in the Acts of the Apostles is using Odyssey 5 as his model, or to take an evangelical approach, it means that the author, who is writing in the first person plural, was on board ship and could tell you what Paul had to say, and therefore you have eyewitness testimony. Or others probably could find astrological associations, as you do, if not on this one, at least elsewhere. So because with these complex narratives that go on and on and on, and of course it takes several lifetimes to explore them all, how does one determine which methodology is going to be ascendant? And is it going to be ascendant for the author? Is it going to be ascendant for the intended readers? And I'm going to make it more complex. Is it ascendant for people who centuries later read the text and imitate them? And so I think if I could put it nicely, you're longer on imagination than discipline. And so the issue is how to create criteria that allow you to carve out a space, which I think is legitimate, about the astronomy and astrology and so on, and to use those criteria to determine why your solution is going to be better than the next. And so I think, since you've done all of this imaginative and creative work on comparing these texts across cultures and so on, the next thing to do is to say, from what you've learned, and I'm going to give you some suggestions on this, how can I determine whether this explanation is going to convince skeptics like MacDonald or the true believers in the Bible and get some traction? I think one of the strong points is that in the ancient world and even today, astronomy and astrology is important for religion. It's in the heavens, it's written and permanent. And so that there is this fascination. So I think that is the strongest piece. The next is, do we have analogies in history of religions of people who are using the same astrological shapes and constellations? And here you've done some comparative work already. You've got you can identify places where you have these analogies. So the business about the target of the inspiration for these things, I think you're okay for. But what about what is it about images that is going to be most compelling to other people? How do artists see these shapes and imagine them differently? But the bigger issue, how can one make a case that this way of viewing these things is more important than other narratological considerations, such as social identity, which we've talked about, such as changing in climate, such as warfare, such as the development of technologies, such as building or shipbuilding or weaponry. And you're a former soldier, you know how important that can be for the Iliad, for example. So those are some examples that I think for people to be more on board with your project, you need to put the imagination aside, that is your right brain, which is obviously very active and creative, and deal with the left brain. What are those criteria that would allow you to say, I can't go with this example because it doesn't meet these criteria, but in these other examples, I think they're strong enough. Now, the very fact, David, that you were selective about what you wanted to show us indicates that you have already a critical purchase on which ones are going to be more successful than others. So I'm sure that you have others where even you have doubts about whether you can make a connection between the astronomy and the narrative. So anyway, that's kind of my generic response to you. It is invited by esoteric.
Sure, and thank you for that. I appreciate the way you said it. So to respond to a couple of those things, I tried to stress that the artwork is very helpful for illustrating in a forum like this, but the texts themselves, for instance, the Genesis text, and it's not just Genesis 3:15, can be used completely independently of any later artwork to demonstrate, I'm arguing, a hypothesis that, we have to look at a hypothesis and its evidence, and maybe it gets rejected over, the future years. But the hypothesis that all of these stories, or I tend to say virtually all of these stories, have a celestial origin when you have specific words like the weaver's beam being used to describe the spear of Goliath. And then we can find connections where a character who is gigantic is described in terms of a weaver or weaving, and a specific constellation that looks like a loom, which I have some examples of that because constantly in the Odyssey, we're finding goddesses at the loom. Calypso is at the loom, Circe is at the loom, and of course, Penelope is always at the loom and then having to tear down what she did each night. This loom imagery is right there in the text. There are loom references in other myths, a weaver's beam for the spear of Goliath, but other giants in the Bible, their spears are always as large as a weaver's beam. Or Samson, when his hair is tied up by Delilah in one of the false answers he gives to her. to her question of how do I take away your strength? Oh, tie my hair up in the loom, then I'll become as weak as other men. She does it. He walks away and pulls the whole loom down with his hair. So textual references, and then if I can show this constellation, which looks like a loom, I could show it to you, is right next to a constellation that's fighting a giant, David, who also appears on the roof to see Bathsheba. So I can show, so the first part of my answer is, I don't need any artwork. I can use texts. I can use the Vedic texts, or I can use transcriptions of myths and sacred stories that were written in the 1800s from the Americas. There's a whole tradition of what are called, patronizingly, the Orpheus myth in North America. The Orpheus pattern of the man going down to get his beloved from the underworld is found around the world. It's found in Japan. It's found in Greek.
Right.
Remember how I said I'm arguing Sagittarius has a characteristic of walking in one direction and looking in the other direction. And you can see this in the constellation itself. You can see it in the artwork. Admittedly, that's not a text in the same way as a written text is, but you can see it in that artwork by the pan painter in the Boston Museum of Fine Art. She's walking one way, she's looking the other way. We can see in the text of the Iliad that Briseis is being led away, looking back longingly. We can see Lot's wife walking one way, being described in the text, looking back. So yes, I'm putting forth a very comprehensive thesis that around the world, this celestial patterning is present. I cannot explain it because it really does blow apart conventional theories. When the first, like there's a Jesuit, quote, missionary in the 1600s who remarked upon, hey, they seem to have an Orpheus myth here in the 1600s. How did that get there? Some people say, well, obviously Christian missionaries must have been talking about Orpheus. I don't know that Christian missionaries are really going around talking about Greek myth. And also it's patronizing to say that it must have come from Europe. And in fact, there are more details preserved in the Native American forms of Orpheus, where once again, he's not supposed to look back. That's a, that's a component of the myth. That's a distinctive feature of a constellation. But in the American myths, Native American myths, there's a bird that tries to startle him. Right next to Ophiuchus is a celestial bird, right next to Sagittarius. Anyway, if that paradigm is valid, that all myth, virtually all myth, in the Maya texts of the Popol Vuh, in the Maui stories, have clear celestial reference. That does take a lot of evidence to support, but it's like saying when quantum physics came out, yeah, you had to have a lot of evidence to overturn or expand physics up to that point, which was Newtonian.
Okay, let me respond a bit.
Sure.
Earlier, you mentioned Joseph Campbell, here with 1,000 Faces and so on. And as I recall, the Orphic myth is one that he identified as having almost universal properties. So that's fine. Of course, for him, the Orphic myth is rooted in the collective subconscious in good Jungian fashion. So he would say that individuals, but even more than that, societies are shaped by deep structure narratives that are satisfying for various cultural reasons. And one of the reasons that the Orpheus business is important is the love of father, the defending the father against, the Clytemnestras of the world, and then you have Orpheus and Eurydice and all of that business. So there would be an alternative interpretation of the ubiquity of the Orphic mythology. And
Yes.
what you want to say is that it has an astrological inspiration. Now, it could have inspiration at certain points, but once you have these things in the culture, then, and this is the way folklorists have criticized Joseph Campbell, that once you have these things in world literature and their compelling narratives, one text borrows from another, one culture borrows from another. And so that Joseph Campbell's hero with 1,000 faces, in this case Orpheus, is not as important as the cultural distinctiveness of each telling. So to take the example of the serpent on the heel and the head, I can imagine in ancient societies, women walked on snakes all the time. So they killed snakes, and the snakes damaged the heel. So I don't know that you need an astrological interpretation of that in order to get there. So this is what I meant before about the calculating the various ways mythemes, let's call them mythemes in the case of Orpheus, are culturally manifested and transmitted. Now, some of them could be astrological. I'm not arguing against that. But the question is how then, what criteria can one use to determine distribution, deviations? One Orphic myth is not exactly the same as another or as another. And folklorists and cultural anthropologists would come by and say, the differences are probably just as important as the similarities, where you have a kind of what I would call a more archetypal, even esoteric way of understanding these similarities. That's not the only one that's out there. So what I meant by criteria is just for you to be aware of the multiple ways that people deal with mythemes in diversity and so on, and distribution. By the way, there's a whole science at this in mythology right now, trying to determine how myths are transmitted and by whom and whom they benefit and how they get changed and so on. And your work and mine are similar in that respect. I have to deal with that all the time too. How are these myths transmitted and so on? I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap this up fairly soon. I have a luncheon commitment, but this has been fun, David, and I'll be looking forward to what you produce.
Yeah, I appreciate those words from experience of having to deal with putting forth a paradigm that you're doing. And I certainly don't deny the possibilities. People have tried to explain this, including Young and Campbell, as you mentioned, for years.
Yeah.
And I don't deny that I don't even deny the possibility of a collective unconscious. But I would also argue that I can prove, or I can establish I can present a lot of evidence for these celestial connections. Perhaps
and
even more provable than a collective unconscious.
No, I would not deny that you can.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate this time to talk and
nice to meet you, David.
And your scholarship.
Gentlemen,
thank you for pulling us together, Esoteric.
No, thank you both. You two have never met or spoken to each other before. So for me, it was very enjoyable to see, and I hope the viewers appreciate what you two have discussed, both in terms of the similarities and the differences. So thank you, Dr. MacDonald. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Esoteric.
Thank you, Esoteric. Take care.